Previously on Tales of the Hunger Games. To the surprise of many citizens throughout Panem, the 100th Hunger Games were announced 2 months ahead of their normal date. However, both capital and district citizens were shocked to hear that this year, the youths of each district would be fighting against each other, until only one male and one female remained, with these district victors ultimately fighting in the grand final once all these district games had ended. District 14's games were scheduled first, and after a relatively short process of pre-game festivities, the games began within a replica of an elaborate ancient castle. The bloodbath had seen 5 of the 16 tributes perish, which rather surprisingly included Connor, whom many capital citizens had tipped as a firm favourite for the male district victor. Sinead and Dylan had run towards the northern undergrowth, with only a bottle of water between them, yet it was noticed that cracks were already beginning to form within the pair's alliance. Meanwhile, Elspeth and Mohammed were in the relatively comfortable location of the courtyard's castle, with the majority of the supplies at their disposal. However, they appeared to have no idea that they were being watched by Aisling from the castle wall during this time. The crowds in Snow Square were clearly excited, as Aisling very carefully ripped off a tile from the outer side of the wall. Whilst Elspeth and Mohammed were both still clearly distracted by their respective activities, Aisling watched Mohammed and held out the tile so that it would drop directly onto his head. When he bowed down once more, she let it fall. Eugenia gasped as the tile fell, but contrary to Aisling's plans, it landed just inches from Mohammed's head, causing only a few small jagged pieces to hit his right ear. He winced as he looked up, although Aisling had already leaned against the sloped roof next to her, so that she was not visible from below. However, Elspeth had also heard the tile hitting the ground, and seconds after looking up, she pointed through the darkness at Aisling, whose outline she could just about see, before shouting to Mohammed that someone was on the roof above him. Aisling immediately swore and ran south along this roof. Mohammed and Elspeth snatched their swords, and before they entered the castle, Elspeth reminded Mohammed to place his shirt over his mouth, in the same way that she had done, in order to stop them from being affected by the gas. However, Rubius reiterated that it had in fact been siphoned out of the castle just minutes after Mary died and Aisling escaped. Elspeth and Mohammed continued up the eastern staircase and towards the upper floor, whilst Aisling was clearly in a panic. She carefully checked the surrounding wall, presumably for anything that she could use to climb down from the roof. Elspeth and Mohammed reached the upper floor as Aisling stopped by a small circular tower, where an attached drain pipe led all the way to the ground. Yet she did not appear to realise that Mohammed and Elspeth had heard her footsteps on the roof above. Aisling began to climb down this drain pipe as carefully yet rapidly as she could, whilst Elspeth quietly ushered Mohammed into the chapel. As Aisling descended the wall, Elspeth quietly nudged Mohammed and pointed to a window at the southern corner of the room, where they could see Aisling's legs. Elspeth then nodded to Mohammed and then to the window, which he quietly crawled towards. The atmosphere was tense in Snow Square, as Aisling passed the window and Mohammed waited by its side, but just as she accidentally tapped the glass with her hand, Mohammed suddenly appeared from beneath and readied his sword. Aisling screamed as Mohammed smashed the window, and as he stabbed her in the neck, she lost her grip and fell to the ground below. Elspeth nodded to Mohammed, and with their shirts still over their mouths, the pair quickly headed down towards the courtyard. Aisling was now unconscious, and Elspeth shouted at Mohammed to kill her before she woke up. He appeared annoyed, and held his hand to Elspeth in hesitation. After muttering a few more words of the intelligible language, Mohammed brought his sword down on Aisling's heart, and her cannon subsequently sounded. Meanwhile, in the northern sector of the arena, Dylan and Sinead rested in the patch of climbing peas. Sinead still appeared somewhat irritated by Dylan's earlier consumption of the asparagus berries, but more by the fact that he was still complaining about his hunger. However, after a while, Sinead admitted that she also needed to eat, and after a brief visual check around them for other tributes, they headed east in search of patches that contained edible vegetables. Within 10 minutes, Sinead was pleased to find a patch of potatoes, and after pulling a few from the ground and checking that they were not discoloured, she declared that they appeared edible and cautiously took a small bite from one. Sinead initially waited before eating any more, and Eugenia stated that this was a wise move, because if they were at all toxic, it may take a while to become apparent, although due to the small amount Sinead had eaten, she would probably not become overwhelmed with illness. However, whilst Sinead waited, Dylan claimed that potatoes were boring, and that he wanted to see what other vegetables lay further to the east. Shaunhead fired back that they were not in the games for a crackin' time, but as Dylan protested, Shaunhead gave in and agreed to accompany him to the east. They carefully headed through the wild undergrowth, unknowingly a few meters to the south of the bush behind which Ronan was hiding, although he appeared unwilling to approach Shaunhead and Dylan, so he remained hidden. Dylan continued to look for different vegetable patches, and they walked past some edible carrots, then a toxic kind of beetroot. However, he suddenly stopped and gasped with pleasure after spotting a patch of mushrooms that were growing against a large tree. Shaunhead tentatively approached behind Dylan, as he happily declared that this was the only vegetable he liked. She appeared suspicious, and Rubius stated that these mushrooms were in fact extremely toxic, and better known as death caps. However, Shaunhead did not stop Dylan from approaching, and it was only when he was about to pick one from the ground that he eventually asked her if they were safe. Shaunhead paused as Dylan waited in anticipation before calmly nodding. As he proceeded to devour the first of these mushrooms, Eugenia let out a surprised laugh, whilst Rubius said that Shaunhead had just gone up in his estimation, before jokingly calling her the mushroom murderer. Shaunhead appeared restless as Dylan ate more of the mushrooms, but she stated that she felt fine from the potatoes, and so she was going back to eat some more, which Dylan appeared too busy eating to acknowledge. Yet just seconds after Shaunhead began hastily walking, he suddenly stopped eating and looked up in confusion, before coughing profusely with what appeared to be a lot of pain. A few seconds later, Dylan turned around towards Shaunhead, who was now almost out of sight between the bushes to her west. Whilst appearing to gag, he asked Shaunhead if she was sure the mushrooms were safe, but after looking into his now bloodshot eyes as he started to cough in an even more violent manner, she let out a bittersweet smile before running west. Dylan shouted a few insults to Shaunhead that had to be censored during later viewings, and he got up to chase after her, but within seconds he had fallen over and was shaking on the floor whilst coughing up large quantities of blood. After noticing that Dylan no longer posed a threat, Shaunhead calmly formed a cross over her body with her hand and asked her father to forgive her, which made Rubius joke that her mother did not apparently care. As Shaunhead continued west, Dylan's cannon sounded, and when she reached the potato patch, she watched the hovercraft collecting his body. Shaunhead collected more potatoes and placed them in her left pocket, before heading back to the climbing pea patch, where she rested for the next hour. As darkness set in, Shaunhead saw Aisling's body being collected from the castle at the arena's southern end. Moments later, she quickly headed back to the patch of deathcap mushrooms, and after ripping off strips of her shirt to place over her hands, she picked up 3 deathcaps, which she wrapped in the shirt strips and placed carefully in her right pocket. She proceeded back to her earlier resting point within the climbing peas, where she rubbed soil over her skin and wrapped vines over her limbs. It came as some surprise to the surviving tributes, but not so much as it had been earlier, when Horn and Plenty once again played. However, this time, it was only the portraits of Aisling, aged 16, and Dylan, aged 17, that were shown, which left 9 tributes remaining. After almost 2 hours of resting in the soil, Shaunhead suddenly became restless, and untangled herself from the vines. Whilst no other action was taking place within the arena, the camera switched back to her, with Eugenia excitedly stating that they were about to see some more action. For the next 20 minutes, Shaunhead very slowly travelled south, mainly through the streams that separated each field. She briefly examined the water that flowed within these streams, but after pouring some in her hand and sniffing it, she simply moved on, and it was at this point that Eugenia guessed she was thirsty. Where there were no streams, Shaunhead rounded south through the next field as quickly as she could. She narrowly avoided colliding with Patrick, who was positioned only 1 field to her west, but fortunately for Shaunhead, he did not appear to have heard her. After 2 more minutes, Shaunhead had reached the edge of one of the most southern fields, in which a herd of 6 cows was resting. She spent a while observing them, during which time Rubius joked that she had no idea what she was getting into, after this particular herd had sent Patrick and then Polly running for their lives earlier that day. However, after quickly checking the field behind her, along with the sides of this field, Shaunhead slowly walked towards the herd. Snow Square was silent as she gingerly approached the 2 nearest cows, who were starting to notice her, but she very slowly pulled some of the potatoes from her pockets, before crushing them with her fingers and holding them flat in her hand towards these cows. Eugenia squealed with excitement as Shaunhead quietly stood still on the spot. whilst also appearing ready to run at a moment's notice. Seconds later, these two cows slowly marched over, and after briefly staring at Shoned, they ate the potatoes from her hand, while she carefully eyed the herd's largest cow, whose udders were noted to be leaking by Eugenia. The other cows began to approach, as Shoned grabbed almost all the other potatoes and crushed them as quickly as she could, before throwing them on the ground. This subsequently distracted all the cows except for the largest, who stared at Shoned as she slowly approached, and carefully took out the water bottle before kneeling by this cow. She watched Shoned over the next minute in a curious manner, whilst the other cows ate the remaining potatoes. Shoned then filled the bottle close to its capacity, which caused cheers from Snow Square, whilst Rubius joked that the other cows were simply angry because they were hungry, to which Eugenia replied that this sounded like Rubius. However, just as Shoned sniffed the milk and proceeded to drink it, a scream from the nearby castle was heard, swiftly followed by a cannon. The cows, who had been eating peacefully, suddenly looked up and glared towards the castle. Shoned carefully attached the lid to the bottle once more, before slowly walking backwards. Within 30 seconds, the cows appeared to notice that Shoned was moving away from them. They slowly turned towards her, and at first walked, then jogged, then charged in her direction. She was clearly panicked, and continued running to the stream at the edge of the field, but just as one of the cows was closing in on her, another cannon boomed out, and the cows suddenly stopped. Shoned kept running, and she soon reached the relative safety of the nearby stream. She then continued back to her original resting spot in the patch of climbing peas, and soon after eating some of her remaining potatoes and swigging some milk, she passed out in exhaustion within the soil and vines. Following Aisling's death, Elspeth and Mohammed had continued to rest within the courtyard for the next few hours, with their swords held firmly at the ready. After Aisling and Dylan's portraits were shown, they continued to theorize about where the other tributes could be, but approximately 2 hours before midnight, Elspeth stated that she was tired, and so she asked if Mohammed would take the first watch before she took the second. Mohammed agreed, and he began to keep watch on his own, but during this conversation, neither of the pair had heard Bess and Clyde opening the eastern door to the castle at a quiet, yet not completely silent volume. The pair very carefully crept north through the eastern ground floor until they reached a window that overlooked the courtyard. At this point, Bess whispered that she would cause a distraction on the western side, during which Clyde should grab whatever he could from Mohammed's supplies, although this made Rubius laugh, and asked if they could not see Elspeth curled up within these supplies, which they apparently could not. Bess quickly headed round to the western side of the castle, then up the stairs towards a nearby suit of armour. She shook slightly as she waited, then threw it over the stairs, which caused a loud crash. Elspeth immediately awoke, but did not move, whilst Mohammed told her to be ready to attack. As she gripped her sword tightly, he cautiously approached the western door and kicked it open, before looking along both directions of the corridor, and then at the heap of armour that now lay at the bottom of the staircase. Seconds later, the northern door to the courtyard swung open, and Clyde ran through the darkness towards the pile of supplies. Mohammed heard this commotion, and watched the silhouette of Clyde running through the darkness, but as he slowed down to grab a loaf of bread, Elspeth quickly jumped up from within the pile and readied her sword, which caused Clyde to scream in terror and fall back. Before Clyde could even attempt to get to his feet, Elspeth sprinted towards him and stabbed his heart, which sounded his cannon. Yet whilst Mohammed was watching this scene, he heard a gasp from above the staircase, and as he sprinted up the lowest stairs, he appeared able to spot Bess on the middle floor above, who then sprinted north along the moonlit corridor. Bess screamed as she ran from Mohammed, who swiftly followed her. Due to his greater height, he soon neared Bess, but instead of continuing to run, she grabbed a vase from a side table and threw it towards him. Mohammed only narrowly avoided the vase, which smashed against the wall behind him, and as he continued towards Bess, she threw a large plant pot, which hit his leg and caused him to swear in pain. Bess screamed as Mohammed angrily chased after her. She continued running as quickly as she appeared capable of doing, but he soon caught her by the neck and threw her across the nearest side table, which saw her fall to the floor, along with an elaborate vase that smashed around her. Although she now had several shards of glass in her skin, which was causing her to bleed, Bess desperately tried to get up, but Mohammed stepped on her left hand, and before she could even attempt to fight, he stabbed her in the neck with his sword. As Bess's cannon sounded, respectful applause was heard within Snow Square, whilst Rubius admitted that she had at least gone out with a decent fight. Whilst the hovercraft was collecting Bess and Clyde's bodies, Mohammed limped back down to the courtyard, where Elspeth had been guarding the supplies. Mohammed nonchalantly stated that there was no more gas inside, but instead of acknowledging this finding, Elspeth angrily asked why he had left her alone, and whatever had happened to them working as a team. Although Mohammed had remained rather calm so far, he became quite annoyed at Elspeth, and stated that he did not want to argue. She agreed that she would drop the issue if Mohammed helped her from that point onwards, and without seeming to pay much attention or even care, he nodded in agreement. Elspeth soon fell asleep, and Mohammed continued to watch all around him for the next 2 hours. At midnight, Horn of Plenty played once more, and the portraits of Bess, aged 15, and Clyde, aged 16, were shown. This therefore left 7 tributes remaining: Ronan, aged 14, Lee, aged 16, Patrick, aged 18, Shoned, aged 16, Polly, aged 12, Mohammed, aged 18, and Elspeth, aged 17. For the next 2 hours, Shoned slept, but occasionally startled herself awake whenever she thought that she could hear someone approaching, although her nearest opponent, Ronan, was almost 300 meters west of her position. Meanwhile, Mohammed continued to keep watch, but almost 2 hours after midnight, when he was clearly struggling to stay awake, he woke Elspeth and asked her to take over the watch. She seemed rather dazed at first, but soon awakened herself before looking around intently. Yet just as Mohammed appeared ready to fall asleep, Elspeth quickly stopped him and said that before he fell asleep, they should check the inside of the castle for other tributes. Although Mohammed did not open his eyes, he could clearly be seen through the night vision cameras to look extremely annoyed. He seemed to feign already being asleep, but when Elspeth shook him by the arm, he realized that these efforts were fruitless. She then stated that they needed to remain together, and as she got to her feet, Mohammed reluctantly joined her. The pair placed their supplies in a cupboard on the ground floor. Then over the next 10 minutes, they slowly yet carefully travelled through the lower western side of the castle, checking each room with their swords at the ready, although most of them were empty of furniture or hiding places. There were a few false scares on the middle floor that were caused by a door slamming shut from a gust of wind through an open window, along with a vase that was knocked off a table by Mohammed's elbow, which caused Elspeth to glare at him through the moonlight. Yet the pair successfully checked all rooms on the floor without finding any more tributes. They proceeded very slowly to check each bedroom on the upper floor. A routine quickly fell into place, which saw Mohammed entering the room first and checking behind the door, whilst Elspeth opened the ornately designed curtains of each bed. They then checked the wardrobes and curtains together, and once satisfied that they had not missed anyone or anything, they left for the next room. After checking the second bedroom, Mohammed joked to Elspeth that they should have slept in this room, but she quickly jolted round, whilst placing her finger to her lips, and he apologetically nodded when he appeared to realise where they were. However, they continued in a relatively uneventful manner, until they had reached the penultimate room towards the end of the northern side of this floor. They entered slowly and checked behind the door, then within the bed. Mohammed whispered to Elspeth that it looked like they were not going to find any tributes at all, and that he looked forward to going back to sleep. Elspeth replied that it had been worth checking, and they walked to the wardrobe. Mohammed swung the door open, whilst Elspeth looked inside, but they saw nothing. They headed to the curtains and ran their swords over the fabric, with no more findings. Then, just as they were about to head to the door, they suddenly heard footsteps running into the corridor from the next room. The pair immediately readied their swords as they ran to the door, but Polly quickly appeared in the corridor and slammed this door. As Elspeth held her sword in the air and ran towards the door, Polly grabbed a chair from the corridor, which she pushed against the door. Elspeth shouted in anger and temporarily forced the door open, before pushing her hand through the door and waving her sword around, just as Polly pushed the chair under the door's handle, and she proceeded to wedge it shut against Elspeth's hand. This caused her to drop her sword, and Polly quickly grabbed it, before slicing it down through Elspeth's right hand, which made her scream in pain. She shouted to Polly that she was going to kill her, and Polly brought the sword down onto Elspeth's hand once more, which caused her to bleed even further. Elspeth screamed at Mohammed to help her, and he at first seemed hesitant, but after she shouted again, he rammed himself into the door, and it gradually opened, which allowed Elspeth to free her hand and pull it back into the bedroom. Polly seemed panicked, but she sprinted along the northern corridor past the staircase. Within 10 seconds, Mohammed had also made his way into the corridor, and he chased Polly, who screamed and dropped her sword as she clipped her hand on a table. Seconds later, Polly came to a sudden stop by the western staircase, and it came as a surprise to viewers when Mohammed slowed down as he heard her, although she was still stepping back from him. Rubius was most intrigued when Mohammed then tried to talk to Polly, but she appeared too scared to listen, and amidst Elspeth's screams from the other end of the floor, she was probably unable to hear him. Polly therefore continued to step back onto the top of the staircase. Mohammed tried to catch her by the hand, but she quickly fell back down the stairs, hitting her head several times as she did so, until she twisted and broke her neck at the bottom of this half of the staircase, which sounded her cannon a few seconds later. Mohammed swiftly returned to Elspeth, who entered the corridor, and as she nursed her bleeding hand in her shirt, she at least seemed content to hear the Deathclaw extracting Polly from down the corridor. Mohammed then escorted Elspeth down the staircase and back to the cornucopia, where they rested in the darkness. Elspeth agreed to keep watch for the second half of the night, and Mohammed quickly fell asleep. Elspeth waited for almost half an hour before falling asleep as well, and they both slept for the next few hours. As the sun rose 3 hours later, the portrait of Polly, aged 12, was shown, which left only 6 remaining tributes. Whilst the sunlight entered the arena, Eugenia performed a quick review of the tributes' current situations. Ronan and Shonette had camouflaged themselves in different locations within the northern section of the arena, whilst Lee was hiding within an eastern stream. Patrick was still resting in the middle of a southwestern field, near to the cows, whilst Mohammed and Elspeth remained in the courtyard. However, a few minutes after this review was completed, most tributes gradually noticed a light drizzle coming down from the sky. Although this weather did not initially appear to affect them, it soon worsened, and within 5 minutes, lightning, thunder, and torrential rain were hammering down over the arena. Elspeth quickly gathered the supplies, while shouting to Mohammed that they needed to hide on the upper floors. He appeared hesitant, but soon agreed, and the pair grabbed the supplies before heading through the western door. Yet just as they were about to run up the western staircase, Mohammed suddenly stopped still. Elspeth noticed Mohammed having stopped, and asked him in a panic what was wrong, but he silently pointed towards the top of the staircase, where a shimmering could be seen. As Elspeth appeared to spot this as well, Rubius excitedly informed viewers that the game makers appeared to want a traditional cornucopia showdown. Mohammed then grabbed Elspeth by the hand and tried to lead her back into the courtyard. She actively resisted, and said that it was raining, but he responded that the others might not expect them to hide there, and after a few seconds she reluctantly followed, whilst covering her hair with her hands. Over the next minute, Mohammed and Elspeth nestled behind some flowers in the northwestern corner of the courtyard, so that they were partly sheltered from the rain, while seemingly out of view of most of the ground floor windows. Meanwhile, Patrick and Lee were each running through the inner fields and past the cows, with Patrick heading towards the northern door, whilst Lee headed to the east. As for Shonette and Ronan, they were becoming even more affected by the rain in the north of the arena, but were continuing to run south. Snow Square was filled with quiet anticipation as Patrick entered the northern side of the castle and Lee entered the east. After a minute of carefully walking past the eastern staircase, Lee spotted Mohammed and Elspeth in the northwestern corner of the courtyard, after Elspeth had briefly ducked above the flowers for a glimpse of the courtyard. Lee carefully headed north along the eastern corridor, and it was then that she saw Patrick, who was waiting at the base of the northern staircase. Lee mouthed and pointed to Patrick that Mohammed and Elspeth were in the northwestern corner of the courtyard, and he quietly headed west along the corridor, until unbeknownst to them, he was stood outside the nearest window and able to see them. Patrick readied his sword from behind the window, and Eugenia held her hands over her eyes as the cheers in Snow Square reached their crescendo. Yet just before he was about to smash the window, a cannon was heard over a crash of thunder. It was shown to viewers that during this time, Shonette had covered her forehead with her hand, which allowed her to see relatively clearly through the rain, and hence avoid running into the nearest herd of cows. However, Ronan was not so fortunate, and he was practically incapable of vision by the time he reached this field. He blindly collided with the herd that Shonette had encountered the night before, and within a minute he had been trampled to death. Seconds after the cannon sounded, Shonette snuck through the eastern door to the castle. On the other side of the building, Patrick had been slightly distracted by the cannon, but he concentrated once again and smashed the sword through the window behind Mohammed. Elspeth screamed and jumped back, slipping on some wet mud by her right foot, whilst it appeared that a jagged piece of window glass had sliced against Mohammed's shoulder, which caused him to shout in pain and jump forward, narrowly avoiding the next swipe of Patrick's sword. Mohammed quickly tried to get to his feet, but slipped back down on the wet mud, as Patrick jumped through the window with his sword at the ready. He winked and brought the sword down onto Mohammed, who quickly placed his own sword in front of his body. Patrick continued to swipe his sword towards Mohammed, who kept pushing himself back along the mud, whilst casting off Patrick's swipes with his sword, until he had almost reached the gravel. Rubeus and Eugenia had both been captivated by this fight, but when the camera angle was suddenly switched to show Elspeth looking dubious whilst leaning against the wall behind, Eugenia quickly joked that she did not know whether to love or hate her, at which point a cannon sounded. Patrick was clearly becoming annoyed that he had not yet managed to strike Mohammed with his sword, but he swore in frustration when he almost slipped on the wet mud. However, whilst he was regaining his balance and trying to hold his sword defensively, Mohammed quickly snatched some gravel from behind before throwing it up at Patrick's face. This made him shout and swear in pain, but just as Mohammed looked on in shock, Patrick suddenly winced and coughed blood. Mohammed then looked around and saw that Elspeth had finally grabbed her own sword, and as Patrick's cannon sounded, he asked why she took so long, which caused Elspeth to huff in annoyance and state that Mohammed now owed her. Yet whilst Elspeth looked back around the courtyard, Mohammed calmly stared at her in bewilderment. Eugenia then hurriedly announced that Mohammed Yousaf was the male victor of District 14's games, and that if another tribute caused him harm, their tracker would be detonated. Upon hearing this, Mohammed and Elspeth looked at each other in surprise, but before either of them could say anything, the eastern door to the courtyard flew open. Meanwhile, after Ronan's cannon had sounded, Shoned very carefully crept past the staircase and into the eastern corridor, but just as she was about to turn the corner, she was hit by an ornate vase that viewers saw to have been thrown by Lee, who had been patiently waiting. Although the vase only hit Shoned's shoulder, it knocked her to the ground, and Lee pounced upon, then punched Shoned. However, she pushed Lee off, and the girls proceeded to roll across each other towards the other side of the corridor, whilst they tried to strangle and gouge each other's faces. Shoned pulled on Lee's blonde curls, but Lee became frustrated due to the short length of Shoned's hair, and she therefore pushed Shoned's head against the leg of a table that contained an authentic fox skeleton. Many viewers in Snow Square, who were dressed to match the zone colours of the tribute they supported, were now going wild as they watched the two fights that were simultaneously shown through the split screen. Most of Lee's supporters cheered as she managed to hold Shoned against a table leg for almost 10 seconds, but just as it appeared that Shoned was about to lose consciousness, she managed to pull the table leg from behind her head, and the table, along with the fox's skeleton, fell ahead of Shoned and onto Lee's head. Lee screamed, and Shoned quickly pushed her off, before grabbing a sharp bone from the skeleton that was later identified to be the fox's femur. Shoned stabbed this bone through Lee's right eye, then breathed out in shock when she appeared to have realized what she had done. Yet just as Lee began to scream in pain, Shoned grabbed her by the hair and smashed her head down against the broken table with such force that her cannon sounded just a few seconds later. Shoned then breathed out in shock, and she swiftly scurried back from this sanguine mess. She grabbed another bone from the skeleton that was revealed to be its ulnar, but just as she limped down the corridor and listened to the rain that was still pouring around them, she heard Patrick's cannon sounding and Mohammed being announced as victor. Shoned looked out at the window to Mohammed and Elspeth before slowly walking towards the door to the courtyard. She formed a cross over her body, swore in terror, then kicked the door open. Elspeth saw Shoned and she immediately shouted to Mohammed that it was the Taff and that he needed to help her. As Elspeth ran towards Shoned with her sword, Mohammed hesitantly nodded and followed with his own. Shoned was still trying to catch her breath, and as she noticed Elspeth approaching, she simply held the fox's ulnar at the ready. When Elspeth was just a few meters away, she stopped for a second and grinned, before charging straight towards Shoned with her sword. However, Shoned managed to jump to her right and narrowly avoid the blade, although this caused the ulnar to fall from her hand. As Elspeth almost lost her balance, Shoned sprang up and punched her face, which caused the sword to fall to the ground. The girls began to fight on the gravel, and Elspeth shouted at Mohammed to help, but he simply stood still and watched the fight as the rain lashed around him. Elspeth was still screaming for Mohammed and shouting that she had helped him, yet her distraction allowed Shoned to pull her by the ear, which caused her to lose her balance and slip onto the wet mud. Sioned then practically threw herself forward and managed to position her knees on Elspeth's shoulders, which stopped her from being able to move, and Sioned proceeded to strangle her. Elspeth was still wriggling too much for Sioned to keep her still, which was causing her grip to weaken, whilst Mohammed walked back to the grass and simply sat on one of the nearest podiums. However, when Elspeth had almost managed to free herself, Sioned's eyes widened in a panic, and she thrust her hand into her right pocket, whilst Elspeth screamed insults at Mohammed. Sioned quickly pulled out the 3 mushrooms that she had kept and stuffed them into Elspeth's mouth as she screamed at Mohammed. Sioned then pinched Elspeth's nose and covered her mouth. She angrily pushed her head around, but was forced to swallow these mushrooms, and a minute later, when Sioned appeared to have run out of energy, Elspeth began to convulse against the ground. Sioned quickly got up and scarpered away, before falling onto the now very muddy grass next to Mohammed, whilst Elspeth coughed blood. The rainfall suddenly diminished, and as Elspeth gradually stopped shaking, Sioned once again asked her father to forgive her, and Mohammed looked at her pensively, before speaking in the intelligible language towards his left and then right shoulder. A few seconds later, Elspeth became completely still, and her cannon sounded, at which point Eugenia announced that Sioned Thomas was the female victor of District 14's games. Mohammed let his sword drop from his hand, and Sioned nervously thanked him for not killing her, like Elspeth had asked. He nodded and stood up, whilst offering his hand to Sioned, who thanked him once again. As cheers and applause were heard in Snow Square, the hovercraft entered the arena, and the pair introduced themselves. This made Eugenia laugh, but Rubius stated that he had not seen them converse at all during the last 3 days until now, to which Eugenia replied that it was indeed a strange way to make a first impression. Mohammed and Sioned were immediately taken by the hovercraft to the newly created Gaul Hospital, where they were held for the next 24 hours under the guard of multiple peacekeepers. However, due to the relatively minor injuries that the pair had encountered within the arena, no major medical care was needed, and they were subsequently taken back to the accommodation tower on the Friday. That evening, Mohammed and Sioned were interviewed by Eugenia within the traditional set of the Dalton Studios that was usually used for victor interviews. However, this year, the district victors were thoroughly searched before the interview began, and armed peacekeepers were stood between them and Eugenia for the entirety of the interview. For this occasion, Mohammed wore an extravagant yet authentic outfit, comprising a shirt, jacket, and kilt of Zone D's blue and green colours. As for Sioned, she wore a sparkling gown that was very different in shape to the flowing ones that she had worn for her reaping and interview, although the colours were practically identical. This interview was certainly different compared to previous victor interviews, with the focus often switching between the district games that they had just won and the upcoming grand final. And Mohammed seemed unaffected, but Sioned was somewhat amused to hear that they had been dubbed the Calm Killer and the Mushroom Murderess within the capital since the games had ended. The pair both explained in a justifiable manner about why they had each ended their original alliances, but when Eugenia asked if they planned to ally for the final games, they looked at each other inquisitively, and Sioned broke the silence by stating that she would potentially be interested, although following this line of questioning, it was noticed that both district victors became more reserved and defensive regarding the following questions. As was the case for Roskinloch, large houses were built for Mohammed and Sioned in each of their respective zones. Once the construction had been completed 2 weeks later, they and their families subsequently moved into and enjoyed the new properties, courtesy of the capital. During the following months, it is known that Sioned's parents arranged for some of their associates to train her with a variety of weapons during the day, while she held many wild parties throughout this house at night. Although this allegedly caused a rift between Sioned and her parents, she did continue with the training that they had organised for her. As for Mohammed, he became much closer with his older brother Ali, who had not lived with the family since an earlier dispute, but he was invited by Mohammed to live with him and the family once more. It is unknown how Mohammed trained for the grand final or if he trained at all, but it is rumoured that he refused to watch the subsequent reaping games of the other districts. Sioned and Mohammed are also documented to have travelled to each other's zones during this time, although it is unknown why these visits took place, and if these visits were linked to the upcoming grand final or the events that took place shortly after District 6 reaping games. You didn't think we were going out that quickly, did you? There are plenty of more games to come. And for those who remember Cleopatra, she's now getting rather big, and she's 4 months old now. And I've just taken a seat in the sun, so I'm going to let her sit down. So, as promised, it's time for our Q&A. First thing I'm going to do, though, is I'm actually going to put in a schedule of the upcoming games. So this could change, but hopefully should stay as normal. Over the rest of May, starting with next Monday, we're going to do Districts 12s to 9. And then I'm going to have a week off. Then 7th of June through to 28th June will be Districts 8 to 5. Then another week off. And 12th of July to 2nd of August, we're going to do Districts 4 to 1. And then the grand final is going to be on the 16th of August. However, that's probably going to be a part 3. I can imagine Monday 16th of August having part 1, the pre-games, part 2 being a week later, and part 3 being a week after that. No, sorry, not a week later, 2 days later, 2 days later. So Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Should be something like that, but obviously I'll let you know of any changes. Now, first question. Lolando asks, if Katniss hadn't volunteered for Prim, who do you think would have won the 74th games? I've thought about this a bit. I don't think Prim would have made much of an impression in the pre-games. Might have made a slight friendship or possibly an alliance with Rue. At the start of the games, Prim definitely would have run away. I really don't see her running in for anything. I think she would have probably survived the first day or two by hiding, laying low. But at one point, she would have needed to come up for food or water, or would have been found by the careers. I think they would have found her before anyone else. And at that point, yeah, I don't see her surviving beyond that. Also, Peter would have gone on the first day because he was found by the careers, but they kept him alive to find Katniss. There wouldn't have been a reason for that, so he would have gone as well. I think the rest of the games would have played out fairly automatically, fairly similarly. I think the careers would have turned on each other at one point. I could imagine Clove and Cato turning on Glimmer and Marvel. But I think Foxface, Rue, and Thresh would have still remained alive. I'm going to say the Mutts will have still got Thresh at one point. I think he might have allied with Rue, but he could have turned on her at one point. Foxface would have remained alone, but she was beginning to run low on food anyway. And although she might have killed herself, she still had Thresh and Cato there as big competition, so I think she would have died regardless. I think it would have been a showdown between... Ooh, I don't know. I think it might have been Thresh, actually, because the Mutts might not have been used in the same way. A Thresh v Clove showdown, because Clove would have probably killed Cato, I reckon, in his sleep for some reason. Clove and Thresh, though, she would have gotten with the knives before he could have got close enough, so I'm going to say Clove would win. But, let me know what you think. Next question. Mayor1 asks, why are the tributes of District 6 such camouflage experts? It has nothing to do with their industry. I've thought a bit about this, but I think because they spent quite a bit of time on morphling and various forms of drugs, during that time, sort of certain avenues in one's brain can open up a bit. And so they might enjoy experimenting with painting themselves, for example. They might even have hallucinations where they do that sort of thing. And they might doodle a bit. So it's something that they probably enjoy doing. And also, because they're likely a slightly weaker district, that's probably one of the ways that they could actually win, just by laying low, that sort of thing. Next question. Ava Fullerton says, hey Christian, hello. What is your favourite book and movie from the original Hunger Games series? I like the first book most of all. I'm a bit naughty. I watched the films first and then read the books. Oh no, actually, I watched the first 2 films, then the books, then the film, the last film. I really liked the first book. As for the films, I like the second one, I think, most of all, Catching Fire. I really like the arena. I like the casting for lots of the actors and actresses of the victors. I thought it was really well done. So I did enjoy the last book as well. I thought there was something slightly missing, though. I would have liked to see a bit more emphasis on the games, but hey, that's just who I am. I know it's controversial to some, but I still like that. I'd be curious to see what they could do with the film as well. I'd be very curious about that. I'd love to see it though. Hopefully once all this illness thing is over. Next question. This is one that I've seen on various comment sections, but is why are some videos split into two parts and not others? So I was originally going to do this just for Quells, because I like to see sort of part one before, see what everyone's like, and then part two do a live premiere, and it has a good atmosphere, feels like we're in Snow Square. However, with the program I use, sometimes the video is so big that it doesn't play properly. It sort of cuts audio and video here and there. So the only way to avoid that, chop it into two. And I quite like it this way though. This was originally just going to be a one-part video, but I do like sort of the Snow Square atmosphere. Next question is by CableJack13, who asks, when Ariadne was introduced in the year 102, were you already planning the events with her after the 99th Hunger Games? Yes, that's all I'll say. Another question there is, why did several Avoxes escape with Ariadne from the roof of the accommodation tower? Some people have asked that. The reason is because any that were left in the tower would have been killed. So she got out some that she was able to. She helped those that she could, because otherwise if she didn't, they would have been left in the tower and killed, like quite a few of the others. Next question is also from CableJack13. Have you ever given up on writing a story and started from scratch again? Yes. Only once, really. It was Wiress. That was, I think I mentioned before, the toughest one I had to write. She was originally going to roam through the trees and be dropping stuff on people. I was just halfway through, I thought, this isn't her. And so I completely switched that over. She was originally going to ally with someone as well. I think it was the girl from 9. And I thought, no, she's a lone wolf, this one. And really had to imagine how she'd win, which was tough at first, but got there in the end. And one thing I found funny actually is Amanda Plummer, who plays her, is actually the daughter of Christopher Plummer, who was Captain Von Trapp in The Sound of Music, which, yeah, just I found really weird. Anyway, next question is Darren Astrail. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. What was the hardest game for you to write on a personal level, and were there any games where you did not want to kill off a character because you can emotionally attached? Yeah, there were some where I did get a bit emotionally attached and thought, sorry, but gotta kill you. Justin and Clear just fell. Yeah, that was kind of a sad one to write, but I knew where I was going from the start, so the ending was one of the first bits I wrote, and then I kind of went back, and that was a bit sad. I thought, I'm gonna kill you. I do feel bad, but hey, only one can win. Delaware as well, as in the 94th one, I openly have dealt with addiction. A year and 2 months sober, something like that. No, 1 month, pushing myself up. Yeah, that storyline was an interesting one to write, because I wanted to show how someone could have used the games to get through addiction, and a bit like with Gregor's storyline. And I knew in advance that he was going to die, but I thought, well, it sends out a positive message. But yeah, that was a slightly tough one to write, but cathartic nonetheless. Next question is Jack Gray. Sorry, I mispronounced that. Jack Gray. Can you tell us about some ideas that you didn't use or storylines that you perhaps abandoned? The crazier the better. So, with Atomica's torturing other tributes in the 96th, especially at the end, that was going to go into much more detail. But I just thought, I was rewriting it and I thought, this is getting a little bit graphic. So I just kind of left it to the audience's imagination and the Capital viewers as well. Also, I was going to deal with a pregnant tribute, a quite heavily pregnant tribute in one of the games. It was actually, I won't say which one, but it was one of the male victors in the 75th Hunger Games. His original game, his girlfriend was basically going to be heavily pregnant and he volunteered for her. That was pretty dark though, and I just thought, no. So quite early on when I was planning, I switched that. Also, gotta be careful how I speak about this one, but I think if there were 100 games in total, at one point, someone would probably try and commit sexual assault on another tribute, most likely a male, would commit on a female. I did think about that as a storyline at one point, but it's a bit too dark even for me, and that's not a story I'd want to write. I'm sure out there somewhere there's a fanfic based on that, but I just didn't want to write that story. Next question is Etoine de Vries. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. What are some other quinquennial quell ideas that you would have liked to have done? I'm not going to go into massive detail, but I'll just read out some others that I had on my list. Age 12 tributes age 12. Next question is Etoine de Vries. And his question is, what are some other quinquennial quell ideas that you would have liked to have done? Sorry if I mispronounced your name, by the way. So, first of all, I would have just done tributes who are age 12. But quite a few people came up with that one, so I didn't want to sort of steal it. Anyone who's over the age of 19. I did think as well of anyone over the age of 50. It will be an interesting game, but maybe not for the best reasons. I've thought of men only, women only, parents of fallen tributes, although that would be pretty harsh. Descendants of fallen tributes as well, because we have to remember that quite a few of them give birth before. Would have been a bit harsh as well on them. Parents of victors could have been done. Pairs of siblings as well. Lots of people seem to suggest that in the comments. That seems to be a popular one, but yeah, it seemed to be so popular I didn't want to use it because I thought that's not really my idea. I thought 3 times as many tributes. Tributes must volunteer, and so basically they say someone volunteer or in 5 minutes we shoot someone or something. And then if nobody volunteers, they just keep waiting until someone finally volunteers. I thought all tributes have to live together beforehand for the week, kind of Big Brother style, but I couldn't really find the right angle on that one. I was going to do no supplies in the cornucopia, but I've ended up doing that in quite a few other arenas, so I didn't do that. No sponsor gifts at all, but actually that's a condition with these games. There are no sponsor gifts. I thought it was social distancing games where there are all tributes that get 2 meters apart at any time, but I thought that might kind of be difficult. And I think we've all had enough of social distancing this year. And I also thought when one tribute dies, they're replaced until that tribute dies as well. So there will be potentially 48 tributes in total, but that will be chaotic with the reapings, etc. Also, I did, for the 95th, I was originally going to do basically anyone between the age of, I think it was 34 and 46, and that was anyone who avoided being reaped during the middle period of peace before the reclamation. I did think of that, but eventually went with the chain idea, which I'm glad I did. Next, Dolly Gippons asks, you told me in a comment once that you're absolutely petrified of seagulls. Why are you afraid of seagulls, Christian? They're evil. They look evil. They sound evil. They smell evil. They peck you. They come out of nowhere. They poo everywhere. They're loud. My finger got pecked as well when I was like 3, so I've always been a bit scared of them. They're just really unpleasant. I hate them. I'm from Hastings, so I should love them, but God, they're scary. No. Anyway, next one. Yeah, even writing the 90th games with that was tough. Fabio Ferreira Toscano asks, what is your favourite ice cream flavour? All of them. In particular, though, I like salted caramel. That's one of my favourites. Lolo Lemon asks, what's your favourite type of tree? I like palm trees. I really enjoy them. Yeah, I like trees. They're alright. I like palm trees, though, most of all. I wish we could have more in this country. But actually, the weather's been alright, but usually it isn't. Lottie Leo 2909 asks, was ist deine Lieblingsfarbe oder Süßigkeit? Or in English, what is your favourite colour or sweets? I really enjoy your videos and hope you understand my German. Dankeschön. Und meine Lieblingsfarbe ist blau. Ich denke, ich liebe auch grün und lila. Und Süßigkeit, ich esse gern Haribo. Haribo ist deutsch, nein? Und ich liebe alle Süßigkeiten. Süßigkeiten, ja. Mein Deutsch ist ein bisschen schlecht, aber ich wäre besser. Dankeschön. And finally, Freya Gindesgard asks, do you support Black Lives Matter and feminism? Yes, absolutely. with Black Lives Matter. I think it's a shame that they've had to protest so much, especially over the last year, but I see why they did. And so, yeah, I support their movement completely. Feminism as well. Yeah, along for the day when we're just all treated equally, when you're based on your actions and words instead of how you look. So, yeah, that's how I view those sorts of things. And I think that's it for my Q&A. Anyway, I hope everyone has a splendid week, and I look forward to seeing you soon for the District 12 games. Toodles.